Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing. With your hosts, Mercedes Pollmeyer and Katya Dev. Okay, so we are coming to the end of our training series with Steve Bechtel, and the hope is to be able to cram a lot into this episode, all about how to basically create your own training programs, what it could look like maybe for a sport climber, a boulderer, a non-competitive climber. So we're going to kind of put everything together that we've talked about over the last like 6 or 7 episodes. And as a reminder, you can always go back to our episodes with Steve. So we talk mostly about energy systems and then some mental tactics that you can use, because that's really a big part of performance. And performance is going to kind of tie into some of the training plans as well. All right, so let's talk about how to create a training plan. But first, something that I'm really, curious about, Steve, is how do you frame training to your athletes? Because sometimes I think some people think that training is only really done for a very short amount of time. And sometimes mentally they can only handle training for a short amount of time. And then the rest of the time they're just kind of like climbing for fun. But like it took a while for me to really get on board basically training all year round. Like I don't really take a break from training anymore. I actually love training now. And if I don't have a training plan, I feel very lost, and it doesn't focus me as well. So when someone is basically starting off a training program, or maybe they're like moderately new to training, is there something that you do to frame what training is for climbers?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, because I think a lot of us feel like we have this training season of like I'm going to train through the winter, and I'm going to with that get in shape for the next 10 months or something. And I think in some ways that we've been underserved by media, or even like the classical Rocky movies of like, I'm gonna get in shape for this event. It's gonna take me 3 to 5 weeks, and then I'm gonna be amazing. And that's really not the case. And it sort of reminds me of this lottery style thinking of like, I'm gonna win big, I'm gonna go to Vegas and win enough money that I can retire, where the vast majority of us need to save slowly for that. And it's the same thing with training. Training is progressed and monitored overload over a long period of time, looking for a permanent change in behavior, or in physical potential. And so what that means in like real world terms is I need to do a little of something regularly enough for my body to say, "Ooh, I'm going to change the way that my system is running in order to be more like the training is demanding." A really interesting thing you can do is to take a piece of sandpaper and run it on the back of your finger for a couple of minutes, and then a couple of days later run it on there a few more minutes, and then slowly add more time to that. And what will happen is you'll develop calluses on the back of your finger, the same as the calluses on the front of your fingers. And you can do it with tanning. You go outside in the sun and sit out there for a little while. And if you do it with the regular overloads, slight increases, you'll get darker and darker and darker skin. And all the physical adaptation follows this same process. And one of the main problems that we see with training, or the training mentality, is I want to like hit it really hard with a ton of intensity and just get it done. And it just doesn't work. Our bodies don't adapt that way. That would be what we call trauma. And what that is it's such an overload that your body just seeks to resume homeostasis afterward. If you just say you started, like you go out, you go out and you start running 20 miles a day right off the couch, because you really want to fast forward your marathon ability. Probably like 2 days in, you're going to have an injury that sets you back for many, many months. And that's kind of what we're trying to avoid. And so, like you said, getting into the mentality of what is training over the course of a long period of time. And that's where I'd like people to start with. What are the main things I need to adapt to? What are the things I want to improve? And the biggest issue with building a training program is over planning, like that we're trying to do too much. Like a lot of people, if they look at the list of things that you feel like you could improve on in your climbing, there's probably 25 things on that list. And the more things we try to adapt to at once, the less we'll move the needle on those things. So we really need to spend a lot of time in planning, coming up with what are the things we're going to focus on to make sure those things happen.
Yeah, awesome. And it also seems like the fitness industry has also kind of given us a false sense of improvement. Like, it's get the gains quick. Here's a 6-week program to send 512,
Yeah.
and I feel like I saw a lot more of that. I'm not on social media as much anymore, so I don't know if that still exists, but it definitely seems like the quick fix is kind of still very popular.
Yeah.
And that it's sexier maybe to
Yeah.
just go and like try really hard for 6 weeks. Some people notice an improvement, but I think, as you said, Steve, like I think people do end up getting a little injured in a very short amount of time,
Mhm.
whereas you would find better results going slower and training more consistently over a long period of time. And with this list of 25 things, um, that kind of leads me to the first question on like how to create a training program. So you have this list of things. Do you do testing, or should we be looking at maybe a questionnaire? How do we decide what to really focus on? It obviously depends on goals, and goals is also a big part of like creating training programs.
Yeah.
But for someone who's trying to create their own program, what do you recommend for testing and thinking about some goals related to the testing?
Yeah, well, testing is its own thing. Like people get real pulled into physical testing because it's real easy to improve those markers. Perhaps one of the reason that finger strength testing is so popular is because it's so easy to improve finger strength. Um, Very much like, say the bench press, one of the most popular exercises in the weight room, also real easy to improve on. And so people are like, oh, it's working. But when we look at testing, we need to look at a more global aspect of what the athlete has to put out in the performance environment. What are the requirements of rock climbing? There's a lot more than just finger strength. Finger strength comes up because our hands are right in front of our face and we're going, oh, I can't hold on to this hold. Or my endurance comes up because I'm super duper pumped. But perhaps my footwork's bad. Perhaps I'm getting pumped because I'm afraid. Perhaps my tactics were bad and I didn't rest enough between pitches. Perhaps my goals were wrong and I'm climbing something that's too hard for me at my current level of fitness. And so looking at a little bit more global aspects is going to be really important. So one of the things I would do would be to think about really seriously, spend some time journaling or video blogging or whatever it is about what feels like it's holding you back on these routes. Like if you are legitimately feeling fear while you're rock climbing, that's an issue that can't be overcome with physical training. And it can be overcome with the right mental frameworks and training and experiencing going through that high level arousal. But if you are just like, man, if I can just get super sick endurance, I'll stop being afraid up here. It's never going to happen. So, am I afraid? Am I getting out there regularly? One of the main things that happens is I'm not going into the performance environment enough to actually see an improvement there. Imagine golf is your sport, and instead you're in the weight room 7 days a week, occasionally getting out golfing just a little bit here and there. Like you shouldn't expect to get better at the sport. And one of the things that happens with a lot of climbers now is that training has become so popular, physical training, that they aren't doing any technical climbing, and that they've eliminated those technical aspects from their routine. And so that sort of mindset, journaling or thought process is really important. And this is one of the places where consulting with a coach, like getting on a call with you for like a 1 hour consultation, just to go through that series of questions, like where are we really limited? Or is it something that I just love to work on? Some people just love hangboarding and they can keep seeing those minuscule gains and they just want to stay with that, but it's not overall serving their big picture. Once it does get narrowed down to what is the physical training I need to do, I think assessing from the performance environment and from past performances is really a simple way to do it. It's not comparing my finger strength to somebody else's in some database. It's when I go to the gym, what are the V grades I can climb on particular hold types, angles, how long a session can I do? What are the things that really turn me off and that I'm afraid of? What are types of moves that I'm afraid of trying to do even? Am I afraid of dynos? Am I afraid of high top outs? And all of those things are, or if you're a rock climber, if you're a sport climber, am I good at overhangs? Am I better at vertical? Do I like crimps or slopers? Do I like compression? And you'll start to see that you'll favor a particular kind of climbing. And so the things that are limiting you from those other types of climbing are probably physical or emotional limiters that you can address over the off season when you're building your training plan. And so those are the things. What are my main limiters and the things I want to work on? And that's what we want to work on off season. And what we do is we take the top 10 list of things that you found that are limiting to you, and then we cross the bottom 8 things off. And then we work on the first 2 things that are limiting. These things will not go away. They won't leave your mind, but the top 2 are going to be critical for a person to be working on in their off season. So maybe it's my upper body strength and my mobility, my ability to do high steps, the flexibility in my hips in order to have good technique. And then I can really work on those 2 things across the off season. And so that's sort of where you start. What are the needs of my training in the physical, mental, and technical aspects of the sport? And what are the top 2 things I need to work on this year? Only 2. If you have a third one, you need to cross it out.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that working on more like skill-based like goals like that is better than trying to pursue a grade?
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Like I like to use the weight room. People that understand the weight room get this analogy really quick. It's like I just want to be able to lift 100 pounds. I don't care what exercise it's in. Right. And so you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Because if you're just chasing a grade and I just want to be able to send 13A, you're like, your thought process is then like, where's the easiest 13A in the whole world that suits me specifically and exactly and perfectly? And then you send that grade and you've gotten that number, but did you level up your skills? Are you better able to send other routes that grade? What you really want is to go find the most anti-style thing you could possibly imagine and try to send your goal grade in that style. The process, the several year process that would go into that would make you a better rock climber. But instead of looking for the easiest way to give you an ego-driven goal, it's the wrong way to approach it. And so what we really want is I want to be able to climb. Like, I think it's a really interesting thing to write this down. Like, what grade can I climb on any stone anywhere in the world, anytime? Is it off width? Is it a roof? Is it a run out slab? Most people that are like, I'm a 13A climber are answering 5'9", on that. And that's the thing, like becoming more well-rounded in those things does bolster your top end ability. Now, you don't need to go spend a season climbing on the grit, but you do need to keep thinking, like, are there things that are holding me back that I'm ignoring because I always seek out well bolted, slightly overhanging, juggy 12As?
Mm.
And that's the main thing, I think, where we're building a training program is like, let's address weaknesses off season. Let's look at our limiters and try to attack those.
Then how do you balance working on weaknesses versus working on strengths? Because I know like a lot of people really do struggle with that mental side of working on their weaknesses. Like they feel maybe foolish or there's some shame in
Yeah.
falling off something really easy.
Yeah.
But they're really, trying to work on that. And I can see that being maybe mentally unmotivating to
Yeah.
continually show up and work on your weaknesses. Do you have kind of a balance that you try to strike in those training programs?
Yeah. Well, you're married, and so like when you and Brenda are in a cruxy situation, it's not like, okay, let's spend the next 5 days just talking about this issue we've got. What do you think? Let's go for it, right? No, so you're like, okay, how do we enter this in a safe realm where we can have a good discussion? How do we make sure that our feelings are heard and that we're hearing the other person? And that's really hard work. And so you do it little chunks of time, like we're going to talk about this for an hour, and then we're going to go back to, like cooking dinner and buying groceries and taking care of the garden. And that's exactly what we do in training. And so what I love to do is get the athlete warmed up, and toward the end of the warm up, we start working on one of the limiters. And this is off season. So this is in the off season training. We'll talk about the seasons in a little bit here, but and then we take and do the entree of the training should include one of your weaknesses. And so let's say you have a weakness that is around your hip flexibility. I like talking to you about this because I know that hip flexibility is not an issue, but you have a weakness around hip flexibility and upper body strength. And so the first bit of a training session, I would address a couple of hip drills in climbing and maybe some stretching having to do with those. And then some upper body strength stuff. Like I'm going to work on some lock offs and some full pulls through, whatever the particular exercises might be. But there are a couple of things that are pretty hard for me. And then I might put in something I kind of like I like doing some abdominal work. And so I do a circuit with 3 or 4 or 5 things that include these limiters, but also include some things I enjoy. And then you can finish the workout with some stuff you really like. Like, I love bench pressing. I love campusing. I'm going to finish up with that kind of stuff. And if it were just a bouldering session, it might be, I'm going to work on my foot placement. Say we're setting it up in a home gym, and the home gym's got a little bit of weight in the garage, a little bit of weights in the garage, and a moon board. Well, I'm going to work on my foot placement for 3 or 4 or 5 sets or problems at the early part of the moonboarding session. So I might do something where for each hand move, I move my feet 5 times and really working on quiet placement, reaching to far away placements, doing all kinds of things that are challenging for my footwork. And then I can finish the session just doing hard problems, but I've worked on that skill. The real problem is saving the stuff you hate for the last. You tend to not do it. And so you've really got to do it while you're psyched. And you need to do it at a short enough frequency, maybe twice a week, that you'll actually do it. Because if it was, let's have a difficult conversation about the friction in our relationship every single day until we figure it out, it's gonna be something you won't do. And so that's the big issue. Do a short amount of it, a couple of days a week, and then move on and finish with stuff that you really enjoy.
Yeah. Awesome. Love that analogy. So in terms of like these kind of like qualities that are a little less measurable,
Mhm.
for example, like hip flexibility, that is kind of like difficult to actually measure unless you're working specifically on a side split or something like
Yeah.
that. Um, do you have any recommendations for people who might not always see very like obvious progression. Um, because I think that is also motivating, is like, oh, I'm seeing progress, so therefore I'm going to continue to show up. But a
Yeah.
lot of the time, especially in these like qualities we can't quite measure, and it's almost like the subtle movement forward.
Yeah.
Do you have any like recommendations or advice around seeing
Well,
small improvements?
yeah, and so you're right. It's really hard to, with qualitative things, it's hard to go, yeah, I got better at that. I'm better at listening. Like I don't know if I'm better at listening than I was 5 years ago, but the thing is if I continue to address it and I'm aware of it, then I start to become that thing. A great example is inside high stepping, and a lot of climbers might not think about this, but with high stepping, if I high step outside, I'm pretty good. Like you can see my foot in the frame of the picture. But if I'm high stepping inside, I'm not as good there. And so when I'm within the framework of my shoulders, if I'm inside my arms, I might not be that good. I might not have the hip turn out to get my feet as high. And if I see that, like there are certain problems when they feel too scrunchy for me or whatever, when I'm doing my initial assessment and looking at my movement, that's the thing where I'm going to be like, when I come back to assess that and I try scrunchy problems again, do they feel less desperate to me? Can I climb at a higher grade than I used to on that? If it's compression or something, and you're like, compression problems, I'm 2 V grades lower than I am on anything else in the gym. And especially if you start to complain about the crag, boulder, or setters, and you're like, man, they don't know how to set because this grade is way off. It's probably you. And that's the really interesting part of this initial assessment. And again, it's worth it totally. And I try not to sell coaching too hard, but it's really worth having another set of eyes on you, even if it's like send Mercedes 5 videos of you bouldering, and then let's have a discussion about it. Then we are like, let's work on hip flexibility and upper body strength. And here's how we're going to assess that. And the assessment is, does it feel easier? Do I dread it? When I come across a high step, an inside high step or whatever on a problem, can I manage it better than I used to? Because it is super hard to address quantitatively. And so the way that we do that is then another round of videos. Do I look better on that than I used to? We all know what good climbing looks like. You can tell in 2 minutes of watching somebody warm up whether they're a very good climber or not. And that's the thing I always think is funny. Like you see road cyclists out there in a group riding down the road. Like they could be out on the bike for their first time and they look exactly like the pros, because riding a bike doesn't show that much until they're racing or something. But climbing, man, the first time somebody tries to go up a moon board, you're like, oh, that person has never rock climbed before in their life, or that person is awesome, because it's like you know what you're looking for. Long way around to these qualitative things just continue to be need to be addressed until you stop hating that particular thing. Like, oh, I hate Gastons, or I hate high steps, or I hate lock-offs. Well, it's probably just something that you need to have in your training program, that you address frequently until it's no longer an issue for you.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Yeah, it's like the things that we tend to avoid. Maybe put a
Yeah.
magnifying glass
And
on that.
and regularity is king on that. And one of the things that we've always talked about with any athlete is like, there's no amount of like, I'm going to do like 8 hours of high stepping for the next week every single day, and then I'm going to scratch it off my list. It's like 3 minutes of high stepping for the next year. That's how we develop skill. That's how we develop flexibility, strength, everything. It's not intensity, it's frequency.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So the last thing, let's see, I've got my list here. Talked about testing. Okay. So last thing I wanted to ask about when it comes to testing and maybe working on weaknesses. Finger strength is always a hot topic. I think it is a place that a lot of people could improve, but sometimes it's overrated and overdone. Do you have any recommendations or advice around when you should start focusing on finger strength? Do you have any numbers, like guiding numbers to help people figure out if they actually need to work on their finger strength?
Well, the thing that's really become apparent for us over especially this last year is that very rarely does a climber fail on a route or boulder when their arms are on the same size edge straight overhead pulling down. And so yes, that's a great place to get stronger. An even easier place to get stronger is when that same weight is being pulled from the ground and the shoulder is in a stronger position. And so now we see so many people doing block pulls from the floor to push those numbers even higher. And here's the really fascinating thing, Mercedes, and we've talked about this before, but when I test straight arm up here, pulling on a 20 mil edge, I can pull almost 200 pounds on a strain gauge, right? But when I get to here and my hand is below the level of my shoulder, that drops to about 40 pounds. And so no amount of this is going to improve this, because this is a position-specific weakness based on the muscles that are being used and the angle of my wrist. And so when I start going like, man, my finger strength is failing on this boulder problem, it's probably not just my ability to hold on to that hold. Like, step away from your moon board, measure the hold. It's a 15 millimeter 4-finger edge. You can obviously hold that hanging from a hangboard. So something else is going on in that position that's preventing me from being able to make this move. And it's going to be position-specific finger strength. Is how we're going to address finger strength in that issue. It might be that my back's not strong enough to hold there. It's probably that my body positioning isn't ideal and my hips are sagging out. But as far as finger strength goes, if I am more than 20% weaker down here than I am up here, I think most of my finger strength work should be down below the shoulder. What about Gaston's? How strong am I here? Lots of people have Tindex or force boards now, and they can test different positions. They're very easy to set up, and you can take a block and pull like this against your strain gauge, get a number there. What about side pulling? What about diagonally? And you'll start to go, oh man, that's a really hard position, or it's hard when I move through this position. And you can make incredible gains as a climber by simply getting stronger in some of these slightly compromised positions. The really interesting thing too, and you've seen this in your training, is like I can hold on to a 12 mil edge up here, and I can hold the lock off on a pull-up bar, but why can't I hold a 12 mil lock off? Right? There's neurological components to all of this movement and combinations of force through the body that we don't take into account when we part it out like that. And so, although I am a big fan of hangboarding, I think hangboarding can be a piece of your training rather than a pillar of your training.
Mm-hmm. Great. I love that. Okay. So let's go on to how to put a training program together. So we've talked about endurance, strength, power endurance, recovery, and performance.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got all of these phases, all of these energy systems. And what I really love about your training, Steve, is that you do kind of follow a non-linear model. It's not like you don't also recommend linear periodization. But I do like the idea of working these energy systems simultaneously, almost like an oven, and you have like the stove burners, and
Yeah.
one burner is turned up to the highest and maybe the others are on simmer. I know for me, kind of like long term, that has helped me become as good as I am now because I've been able to continuously work these energy systems. Um, so for let's just like focus on like non-competitive climbers, the average like lifestyle climber who wants to get better.
Yeah.
How do you recommend them starting with putting a program together for themselves?
Yeah. So the most important thing is what's your schedule? What are your non-negotiables in your week? I encourage people to get online and print out a blank weekly calendar that is just like, I'm gonna write all of my stuff on there. Like I work from 8 to 6, and I have kids soccer practice and whatever, but all the things that you don't get to change in your calendar need to go on that calendar. So often we read a book or see a, hear a podcast, see a program, we're like, oh, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do the 40 days of strength program. And then you're like, well, wait a second. I do not have the capability in my schedule to do this. And so immediately you've hit a conflict, a big friction point in your training. And we need your training to have as few friction points as possible. And so what you can actually fit in a week is really critical. And we need to even be conservative in that. If you're like, sometimes I have 3 hours on Wednesday nights, but sometimes it's only 2, we're just going to plan for 2. But we need to look and we go, can I put the training in regularly throughout this week? If the answer is, I can't find enough time to actually do training, which is probably the minimum for a normal climber, is going to be 3 to 5 hours a week of exercise and climbing training. So that's the baseline. If you're a person that can't find 3 to 5 hours a week, you need to call me and we'll find it in your schedule together. Most of your time, like one of my favorite things to do with athletes is, let's look at your phone usage time. If you don't use your iPhone at all and you still don't have 3 to 5 hours a week, then I'm going to be like, oh gosh, we got some major issues there. But for the most part, it can be like, put the damn phone away and do the training. For a lot of people, it's really a matter of holding time in their schedule. And so once I've built out what's non-negotiable in my schedule, I need to go into that schedule and block out, and I write this by hand. We're not doing it on your calendar on Google Calendar yet. Writing out, like, I'm going to train for 90 minutes on Mondays. I'm going to train for 90 minutes on Wednesdays. I'm going to train for 2 hours on Saturday, and block that time in. And we just need time for training. And then you need to look down the calendar for the next 3 to 6 months and see, can I hold that pretty regularly through that next period of time? Because if you have a big trip to the Mediterranean coming up and you aren't going to train at all, we need to know that. We need to make some considerations there. But otherwise, if it looks like you can hold that schedule, and most people are married to a weekly schedule, then we're going to go onto your Google Calendar and we're going to put that time in, and we're going to prioritize training. Training is essential for progress in sport. It is also, I think that the person that dedicates 3 to 5 hours a week to improving themselves physically, to having the break from their normal day-to-day grind, gets those hours back in better productivity when they actually go back to the office or go back to their family or whatever it is. If you can't break away from your routine, I think you tend to operate in a really narrow bandwidth, where if I can stop and go climbing for 2 hours and come back, I'm going to be back at 100% when I come back to work. So let's make that time in the calendar. And once we have that calendar set, then we get to start playing with the pieces of it. So, and you and I have talked about so many of these things, Mercedes, but one of the main things I love for people is to have block programming, where in a given week, I'm going to work on my main training need 2 out of 3 sessions. And so if I have 6 sessions, that would be 4 sessions a week I work on that. But let's stay with the average person that's just trying to get some training in. So we have 3 sessions a week. My weaknesses that I figured out for my off season are going to be upper body strength and my flexibility in my hips. And so 2 of those sessions, I'm going to be working on strength, and hips, and then some other stuff too. And a lot of it is just climbing, right? I still want a lot of bouldering in there. If I'm bouldering 3 days a week, I'm probably just going to get better anyway. But I do want to address those strengths and make sure that we're eliminating anything that are issues for me. The third day of the week, I'm going to work on all of the other things that are just kind of on the three other simmer burners. I can work on some endurance circuits. I can do some explosiveness. I can work on some other techniques. I can just have fun with my friends. And so then my off season might be 2 or 3 months of just repeating that same general cycle. We can change the details of the workout, but we need to be addressing those specific things in the way that we've discussed in the previous podcasts. Strength falls in these parameters, endurance falls in these parameters. But if we set up a simple block program and it's like 2 days a week of addressing the main goal of that training phase, 1 day a week of maintaining all the other stuff, it works really well for a lot of people. And so then we kind of look at having 4 main phases a year, and it's the off season, which is usually winter in the Northern Hemisphere. And I would say that's a 2 to 4 month long period for most people. Then we have preseason, which is usually about a month. And then, so that might be, say that's March. And then we have in season, and that can be a couple or 3 months. That would maybe take you April and May, for example. Then we would have postseason, which is really just like, man, that was a lot, focusing on trying to send a bunch of hard problems. I need a little bit of time off. And that's usually a week or two. And then we start back into off season. And so I like my athletes to have a big long off season in December, January, in the middle of winter, and then a 1 month off season and strength building period in the middle of summer. And then we repeat it. So you have 2 cycles a year that we go through like that. And the cycles vary really according to how the athlete adapts. And it's really hard to say, oh yeah, you definitely need exactly 6 weeks for this, because sometimes there's vacation that goes in there. Sometimes you get sick. Sometimes there's an injury that occurs. And so it is variable. But if you kind of keep with the spirit of that, we have periodized programming happening, and then we do have these block things happening too. And your reference to the nonlinear stuff, it might be confusing for people, but nonlinear is where you're sort of going between strength and explosiveness and endurance, just in a cyclic manner between each training session. And that can work very well too. But I love to that in season, because if I have you going up to Squamish and to Leavenworth trying to boulder, and in the gym, I'm having you try some strength stuff and some endurance and some power in between your performance sessions, works out really great. You keep your fitness up, and you can sustain an in-season phase for many, many months. So I think that's a really good way to build it. It's a lot to it, but the most important thing is to build a program, follow the program, and then assess the program, and then make small modifications to what you did.
Yeah. Do you think that, because I think a lot of people have FOMO, like they listen to podcasts, maybe they'll listen to this one, and now like they're changing their program based on what the recommendations are. Like, like maybe starting with less in the program and then slowly building from there, especially if you are time constrained. Yeah. Is there like a minimum? Do you have like a minimum guideline of this is how little you can train to still see progress?
Well, it is interesting, like the number of people that are like, oh yeah, I tried that diet and it didn't work. But a diet intervention can often take 6 months to even show any tangible results. Short of like some mass gain, mass loss, fluid gain, fluid loss, but actual health results on your internal organs, you could change the way you're eating. You could go to a vegan diet, or you could change to a paleo style diet, and really the function of your endocrine system, of your respiratory system, all these things, it's a very long tail event. It takes a long time, and training is the same way. And so I would say the minimum for any sort of tangible intervention is probably 10 sessions, and 10 that are progressed well. I've had people that have, like, you give them a strength program, and then they go in and they do the same weights, same reps, same sets, for 10 whole sessions. So it's basically the same overload. And then they come back and they're like, yeah, it didn't work. I'm like, oh, of course it didn't, because you didn't progress it. And so it's 10 properly progressed sessions is where you're going to see results. I've heard of people doing, you go in and you do your first set of 4x4s, a 4x4 bouldering workout, and you get done with it and you're like, oh my God, that was awful. And then you go and you do it again and it's a little less awful. And then you do it again and it's really maybe not all that bad. And so then you're like, okay, well, that seems to have worked okay, but you only did it 3 times. 10 sessions into that overload, you change the capability of your system to adapt to those things. That's why I love the super low intensity, or the not chasing intensity, but chasing regularity and volume, is huge. Like our ladder strength programs that we do, or something like Emma Abramson's hangboard program, where you're just like, oh, this is really easy. This is really easy, really easy. But 8 weeks later, you're the strongest you've ever been. You're like, oh, okay, I understand how training works now. Mm. I think that there's so many parallels to the way that finance works and savings. It's like saving $10 a week doesn't feel like it's working at all when you're like 10 or 12 or 15 years old. But if you started at age 10 and we're just plugging that money in, by the time you're at age 60, you are like, whoa, that really, really, really worked. And it worked better than you can't even accelerate it later in your career. And so that's the really important thing about building these training programs, is to build one, start doing it like you're saying, and stay with it. Take notes. I love doing this. The FOMO notes are really important. I have a whole notebook where when I'm reading articles or listening to podcasts or whatever, and somebody suggests a new idea, I'm like, oh, I'll try that. I should check that out. And maybe even like 1 session a month, I could play with those various things. And then slowly start to go, oh, that's a legit thing. Oh, that's actually really a legit thing. I'm going to implement that. One of the things that's, we're constantly evolving. And one of the things that's been really interesting for me over the years is a change from like bilateral squatting to unilateral things like split squats, lunges, rear foot elevated split squats, and understanding that we're still seeing great leg strength numbers from our athletes, but the risk is a lot lower. Their skill acquisition is a lot higher, and the sport specific nature of their strength has improved. And you're like, okay, that was good. But if we just went, oh, I'm changing to that right now, we wouldn't have developed the same way. And so I keep the list, and I'm like, oh, I should try rear foot elevated split squats for this. I should try doing pull-ups on rings instead of a bar. I should check this out. I should see if doing multiple days in a row is useful. But I can't change my training every time, because then it's no longer training. It's just exercising.
That's right. Always going back to consistency over anything else, and variation can be good, but do it at a less consistent period, I guess. But what I like about trying variations is that with people who are really curious about what things are, it kind of feeds into, it gives them that nourishment of like trying something different and playing around with something. Because in the end, yeah, we're climbers and we do like to experiment and play. But yeah, you can't forget about that consistency. Okay, so I wanted to go back to, I think you really focused well on the off season, and you mentioned a preseason, and that was about a month or so.
Yeah.
What are we trying to focus on in a preseason?
Well, we talked about general to specific to simulation strength, that kind of continuum, and like a general strength pulling exercise might be like a weighted pull up, and then a more specific variation might be an offset pull up or a destabilized one. A really specific version would be like pull-ups on a hangboard, and then I'd get into actual climbing, pulling movement. And so there's a continuum that moves through all of these things. And so off season, we get the most out of general strength and general finger strength. So I might go heavy pull-ups and some hangboarding and some, position specific finger work. And then as I get into the preseason, that's when I start to kind of marry those things together. And I might do my pull-ups on an edge, or I might do those offset pull-ups. And so I'm still potentially using some strength, but I'm also looking forward to what am I doing in my performance season? And I'm going to morph the strength and power developed in the off season. And almost every one of us will have a strength and power focused off season. Very rarely do I say, oh yeah, the focus of your off season is light stamina, because strength and power are fundamental aspects of all sport. But the preseason then is a transition from a strength and power general focus into what my performance is going to look like. Your performance phase for this spring and my performance phase for this spring were profoundly different. Yours was hard bouldering. Mine is endurance-oriented sport climbing. And so even though our winter training might have looked really similar, the preseason starts to see a change there. And we see that preseason switch. And I go into more stamina-oriented thing with some strength maintenance. You go into more tactical, boulder-specific stuff, maybe some tension compression, specific movement on a boulders or on a moon board, and then we go into our performance season. And so that preseason phase is a transition into what we need in performance. Mm-hmm. So if it's stamina, there's more of that. If I'm going to be doing alpine routes, that's when I really start ramping up my aerobic work, that kind of thing.
Nice. Okay, so then performance phase. I think this is maybe where I feel like I've gotten a couple different personality types coming into performance phase, where either they just forget about all the other training and just have fun outside and pursue their goals, or the other personality type is like, oh, I got to keep training really hard and try to perform. So what is a good balance for boulders and or sport climbers to strike?
I think a declaration of intent at the beginning of each week is really important for an athlete. And it can be like with your meeting with a coach weekly. It's great. How is your performance phase going? And what's the intention of this performance phase? If the intention of your performance phase is to eke out 1% more finger strength on the hangboard, that's great. But I'm just going to take away all that rock climbing we were doing to make sure we can focus on the hangboard. If it is just to go out there and have fun, let's forget about those strength and power oriented goals we had of doing harder routes and just go out and climb a bunch of easy routes with your friends. And because we immediately start getting weaker in a performance phase, when I'm trying to do a hard route, I tend to rest a lot between burns. I tend to not do a lot of training volume. Because I'm always trying to save myself for the next red point day. And so if that next red point day is 2 days away, I'm like, oh, I probably could use 2 days of rest. So naturally, my capacity drops off. Naturally, my strength drops off. And that's how most performance phases end up wrapping up after 4 to 6 weeks. People are just like, oh man, I'm just like, I can't do this anymore. I'm beat up by my climbing. And it's really because you've let your capacity drop away. And so what I suggest is that at least 1 day a week for most athletes, we continue to maintain a high level of strength and explosiveness. And like I said, that nonlinear cycle works really well there, where you're like, I'm going to go out and try to red point on Sunday. I'm going to take a day off. And then Tuesday, I'm going to work on some explosiveness and do a little bit of work in the weight room. I might climb again on Thursday. Maybe Friday, I can get a little bit of a stamina session in the weight room or in the bouldering gym. And then Sunday, I can start red pointing again. So there's still some training associated with those in-season phases. And you can come to me with a story or an example. It's like, oh, I saw Andra, and he doesn't train when he's on a climbing trip. But that's great. But the guy is also climbing a dozen pitches a day, 4 days in a row. And the average climber, you and I, are not doing that sort of thing. And so we've got to do something to maintain that high level of strength and power. And so for every story we have of a success that's doing that, it's a success story. We have data that suggests that most of us don't fall into that story, and that we do need to maintain our strength. We don't need to just like get out there and climb and have fun. The vast majority of people that are recommending, hey, just climb more, aren't in the real world. Most of us don't get to just go climbing more, or we would already be doing it.
Okay, that's wonderful. So now one question I had, so we did talk about recovery, but do you schedule deloads for your athletes? Is that something people should be considering in their programming?
Well, the deload leaves really good clues. And so the first thing I do when I'm planning training is I plan it in 4-week blocks rather than in months. And so I then end up planning 12 4-week blocks of training per year. And if we do the math on that, that's 48 weeks a year. And so then that leaves us in this extra 4 weeks. And those are the 4 weeks that your kids are sick, or that you're traveling, or that you just couldn't make it to the gym because you were busy at work. But we got to allow for some flexibility there. And so you can take those 4 weeks and you can pepper them in anywhere within the training year you want. And if you have a week off here and a week off there and a week off here, no damage to your training program. And it's probably useful because they are these mini deloads for you. And if you're a serious athlete and you're like, I got to take a week off or take 5 days off of my training, you're going to be like stressed about it. But this understanding that I have not had athletes come back to me and be like, oh yeah, I really shouldn't have taken those 5 days off. It set back my whole program. It just doesn't happen. And so you can just take it. You're in week 3 of a 4-week build, take a week off, and then we just get right back into it. To start right back into week 4, same intensity, whatever else, everybody can handle that. And then after a really good performance phase, when you send your hardest problem and you just spent 2 weeks at Squamish, it's probably not wrong to take a week, assess a little bit about what happened. Where was I weak? Where was I strong? Where did I show up mentally for this thing? And then what do I need to be doing in this next building phase? And so you can take that week and play with some new exercises, sketch out some stuff, but take the time that you would normally just be grinding it out in the gym and take some of that and put it back into planning. And so I love a week off, to even 2 weeks for some athletes after they've had a really good performance phase. What people want is just to keep sending, like I'm just like, now I'm fit. I'm just going to send 100 boulder problems. I'm going to do 2 a week for the next 50 weeks. But that it doesn't happen. And so we might as well go with our biology and go, okay, I'm going to take a couple weeks off, take another big, deep breath, and then go back into training with a really good plan that's based on last year's plan with improvements. And almost every athlete has already seen the things that really help them adapt and move forward. Do I need an 8-week phase, or can I do that in 6? It seems like I'd like to take 2 weeks off at Christmas. I should plan that for next year. I really got burned out toward the end of this phase. How can I change that next year? And if we take enough time and we keep good enough notes through the season, most of us can come up with a really workable plan for ourselves within a couple of training years.
Yeah, I tend to go back and forth. I think it depends on the athlete that you're working with, where some of my athletes will have these natural deloads because they have a full-time job, they have family, people get sick, they take vacation. And then I have other athletes who are, love training, and I have to force them to take a break, where it is kind of like a scheduled every maybe 4th week, you're still training, but you're just doing less of the training to allow some of that recovery. And I do see kind of some mixed opinions on percentage deloading. It's something that I used to do a lot because I did a lot of body weight training and like really hardcore body weight training. And so you had to deload at like every 3rd session. And I did see results from that, but I do wonder, I question whether does that mean that the training that you're doing is maybe a little too hard and it's not something that you can constantly show up for. So those are some thoughts around deloading, things that I've experimented with. Do you have any thoughts there?
The percentages are like they're it's fun to go like, oh, I need to deload 60% volume and 20% from intensity, and there are numbers people that like that kind of stuff. But really what I would say the simplest deload is to take one extra day off, just like get rid of one of your sessions. And then if you've kind of been varying between 45 and 60 minutes on your bouldering or whatever it is, just lean toward the lighter side of it, and be aware that I think one of the hardest parts is like your whole life is this pursuit of being special. I'm me, I'm Steve, and these are all the special parts of me, but I'm not special when it comes to adaptation to overload. And part of the adaptation to overload is this big biological cycling that happens. Like, I don't know anybody that doesn't sleep, right? Sleep is a colossal waste of time. It's a third of your life you spent just laying there. And if you could eliminate that, you could be so productive. If I could work the midnight to 8 a.m. shift at the Loaf and Jug, and then then I could have the whole day. But we need that time off. Sleep is really, really useful. It might be the most useful thing we do athletically. And so the training follows the same kind of patterns. And anybody that can continue to train hard and not have to take that time off, like your super motivated athletes, isn't reaching anywhere near their potential. If you know somebody that can climb V7 just straight across throughout the year, that person is probably a V10 climber that's just not getting it done. And that's the thing, is that they're not allowing enough recovery to let their body reach these high levels of intensity. It's the same thing as sleep. Like, you could probably functional, like you've read those things where people are like, oh, I take these mini naps. Like I nap 20 minutes every 4 hours and I've been able to stay up for the last 20 days. But those people are functioning at a fraction of their possible capability. And so let's just understand that that's true, that we need that time off. We all need to have meals. We all need to sleep, and we all need to have recovery periods from our training. And so once a month, dump one of the sessions out of your program and go sit on the couch or go for a walk or whatever. And back off a little bit on those other things. And that's a good place to start. If it doesn't feel like it's quite working, you can do more backing off. But intensification is almost never the answer. And if that's always your answer, I think that you're constantly not hitting your potential as an athlete. I just don't see it. And I see a lot of athletes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to go back to like basically your body as a battery, you do have to like recharge it, otherwise it's not going to function. I think a lot of people are in survival mode and not in like thriving mode. I think that goes to that includes like diet, that includes sleep, all of these other things that they're like, well, I can survive off of 40 grams of protein. Yes, but are you getting the most so that you can actually perform the best? So I think that's a really good mental shift.
Yeah, I think that, there's like a saying that's like attributed to maybe like George Washington or somebody, that's like, if I had 2 hours to cut down a tree, I'd spend the first hour and a half sharpening the axe. And really that's the idea here, is like, if I plan it well and if I have a structure that I can work from, and then there's an end point to my training. It's not just like, I'm going to go to the gym and boulder until I'm too fatigued to boulder. And I go, I'm going to boulder for 75 minutes and then I'm getting out of here. Because if I have an athlete that can go in and boulder for 60 minutes and go home, and then come back the next day and boulder for 60 minutes and go home, come back the next day and boulder for 60 minutes, that person's getting way more good bouldering than the guy that just kicks his own ass on Tuesday nights for 3 hours. Same thing with your eating, your sleep, and everything else. And if we can plan, if we can put the time in required to plan good meals and make sure that we're holding on to our sleep time, and taking the time it takes to get organized, man, your productivity goes through the roof in every single one of these things. The Climb Strong management team now has a 90-minute meeting every week. And guess how psyched I was about that? I'm a person that's strapped for time, and I was like, you're fucking crazy. But it's been the best thing we've ever done for the business, because we are super dialed in on what our next action needs to be, and when we need to get started on this thing, and when we need to get ready for this part of 2025. But we have a plan where it used to just be Alex Bridgewater and me sitting here going like, oh, what other fire do we need to put out on this list? Oh shit, we didn't film a video for this week. We got to get on that. Like, just stand up, I'll get my camera out. And now that with the planning process, it's the same thing. There's a lot less stress for me, because I have 1 or 2 tasks that are essential for that day. And then I have a bunch of other things I can work on if I feel inspired to, rather than just like, oh my God, look at this overwhelming list of stuff. Because if it's just like, as we started with this discussion, I have 25 things I need to do to get better at rock climbing. I'm never going to get them all done if I can't organize them. And I'm never going to be able to get my head around it if have 25 main goals. But if I said, the one thing that's going to move you forward in your training is to improve the way that your hips move on the rock, and we're going to do that through flexibility and strength training and some focused skill work. And we're going to do that for the 6 months from here until whenever that is, December. When we get to December, you are going to be good at that one thing. And that's one of the 20 things we can check off the list. We can move on and work on the other ones. If we work on all 20, your hip stuff is going to still suck in December, as will all other 19 things.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Okay. So I think we're getting kind of to the end here. And I had a couple questions to kind of wrap this up. That's a little bit more specific. I want to talk about some like sport climbers who might not have rope access. What do you recommend for them, as even in like this preseason? Like, how do they work on endurance, if they don't have a sport climbing wall, even to clip it, like that technique of that, everything that goes into sport climbing.
Yeah.
How can a sport climber train?
Yeah, so that's it. That's interesting. And I think that indoor sport climbing is actually not that useful for real world rock climbing. So this is a good segue. I would rather have my climbers bouldering or using a bouldering wall, simply because the mechanics, like getting the ropes out, trying to climb on some, like the set problems are just that much different than most rock climbing, that the skill transition isn't there anyway. And so what I like to do is look at duration and intensity of the planned performance days. And so if I was last year climbing 511A for a couple of pitches and then warming up for that, so been getting a total of 4 or 5 pitches in a day, the pitches take about 5 minutes to climb to the top of, and I was mostly climbing 2-3 days a week. I can adjust for the simple things of intensity and duration and try to start addressing those things. And so, like, if my pitches if the crag I'm at just tops out at 80 feet, I don't need to have 30 minutes worth of stamina. I just need to have the stamina to be able to complete those pitches. And so I want to start building like bouldering in that starts to address that. And so I might do something like, I'm going to do one problem a minute for 10 minutes, like 30 seconds of climbing, 30 seconds of rest. And I'm going to keep doing that. And once I can do that, and it can be very easy problems. I'm just training for stamina here. It doesn't have to be intensity. So it's V1s, 30 seconds of climbing, 30 seconds of rest, and I'm doing it for 10 minutes. Then I can start shortening the rest period. 30 seconds of climbing, 20 seconds rest. And then maybe I'll do 2 problems back to back with 20 seconds rest. 3 problems back to back with 20 seconds rest. And then eventually I can get to where I'm just like climbing up and down on these V1s for 10 minutes. And then I'm developing the ability to keep moving for the duration that's required at the crag, but I don't ever have to rope up for it. Then I can also still be doing bouldering to improve my ability to do cruxes, keep my finger strength up and all those sorts of things. But I don't actually have to be on a rope. Now, if fear is an issue, if the technical skill of belaying and clipping in and all that is an issue, you're just going to have to take that as part of your, once I get to the crag and I'm out there in season, I need to develop these skills, but physically you should be ready for all that stuff. And then as far as the duration of the workouts goes, you just want to start to address, it's hard to address a whole climbing day at a gym. You're like, okay, well, we got to the gym at 9 a.m. and we're going to be here till dark. And so what you really want is like, I'm going to do 10 minutes of climbing. I'm going to rest at least twice that long, and then I'm going to do it again. And so if your normal day is 5 pitches, you're going to be at the gym for a couple of hours doing this kind of stuff. But we want to keep pushing capacity, which is the amount of stuff we can do, until we're at the level we need to be. And then we can start increasing intensity. And so once I can get to 5 pitches, then I can start putting some V2s into those little circuits and making myself get better stamina there. And I keep building intensity and then keep building capacity.
Lovely. All right. So another question for sport climbers, how am I going to ask this question? I think people maybe who focus a little bit more on like their strength stuff in the off season, like let's say endurance isn't really a problem for them, so they're focusing on strength, some skill work, and then they're approaching outdoor season now. How quickly can you train endurance to kind of come back to be prepared?
Yeah, so there are two things. There's your current potential for endurance, which is like getting back in shape for it. And lots of people just hang out there. They don't ever improve their total capacity, their endurance capability. They're just like, oh, I'm in bad shape for endurance. And then 3 weeks later, I did a bunch of intervals, and now I have pretty good endurance. And then they get out of shape and they come back in shape. If they really have a hard time with stamina, it takes these longer cycles of 3 to 5 to 7 months of having progressive endurance in the system, because it's a big physiological adaptation. We have to improve the intake of oxygen. We have to improve the delivery of oxygen through the blood to the muscle cells. And that includes actually putting in new plumbing, which is hard to do, more capillarity. And then once we're in the muscle cells, we actually have to improve the mitochondria, which are the power plants within the muscle. And so all of this stuff are these major physiological adaptations. And, like you cannot expect that in 2 weeks. And so it is like continuing to adapt and push that. So that's a long answer for, you can ramp up your fitness in probably 3 weeks of really intensified getting fatigued, but that's just getting you better at handling being fatigued. If we want to really get good in endurance, we need to take long-term cycle and build the ability to not get tired in the first place. And we talked about that in the endurance podcast. But I think the really important thing is like, if I'm just, if I'm close to having the stamina to get to the top of the routes at my crag, or to finish entire days of bouldering, or be able to handle a big old scramble comp, that's great. I can ramp that up real quick. But if I'm totally falling short and I'm just never making it to the anchors, or I get pumped after one route and I'm done for the day, we need to address endurance as a primary goal, and probably for a long period, 6 to 12 months.
Mhm. Yeah, it seems like a lot of people tend to do the repeaters on a hangboard before
Yeah.
they and yeah.
Well, and it's really interesting. Like, imagine a runner doing like toe endurance in order to prepare for a race. Because it's part of it. It's surely, having your feet ready for running is going to be essential, but that might not be all you need to do. And I think that that's the thing that's really fascinating is like I trained a couple of pro athletes that live in Spain and climb on these hard stamina routes. And one of them was talking about climbing at Santillana on 514 plus, and his back and his respiratory endurance being a limiter more than his fingers. Like, just the fact that his back got so tired that he couldn't lock off anymore. And he just couldn't get the oxygen in. And so I really don't think that finger and hand endurance is the primary limiter. It's just where it shows up. It's like the last thing that happens. But it was your crappy footwork and your poor breathing mechanics and your bad tactics that led you to get pumped in the first place. And so again, we go back into that assessment. Like, am I just the most awesome tech climber? Am I doing all the moves perfectly? Is my pacing really good? Is my respiration perfect? Is my finger strength and power optimized? Is my mindset where it needs to be? If all those are yes, then let's work on endurance.
Mhm. Yeah, and going back to kind of the qualitative analysis and taking really good notes every session.
Yeah.
Like how could you have improved this session? Where did you notice the weaknesses? I think that's going to give you a lot more rather than just guessing at it all the
Yeah.
time.
Uh,
Okay,
Big
yeah.
mistake I made early on, just a final thought on that. Big mistake I made
Mhm.
early on was seeking fatigue as a way of improving endurance. Like, if I can just get really pumped at the end of the session, the next session I'll be better. And that happens a little bit. That does help a little bit. But really, if I go to the end of a session and I go, you know what? I want to do as much more activity as I can without hitting a point of absolute fatigue, that's going to lead me a lot further. So instead of burning it out on a really pumpy 12A, what if you did 3 not very pumpy laps on a 510 and just got lots more movement in the aerobic zone? We're going to develop the capillarity. We're going to develop the mitochondria. We're going to develop endurance capability rather than the ability to get super duper duper pumped. And I think that that's going to be a game changer for almost every athlete that can get their mind out of fatigue seeking as a means of exercise.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it is part of culture, not climbing culture, but like culture, fitness culture, where we're chasing that suffering,
Yeah.
and maybe there is a lot of ego, or maybe you don't want to look stupid. And so you want to try as hard as possible, or there's someone you're trying to impress. I don't know, but I see it a lot. I see it a lot in climbing gyms, in the weight room. I see a lot of people going to failure and pushing it over and over and over again. Um, and yeah, that's not how you get long-term results. And there's a lot of ego in that. And I think it is hard for people to take their foot off the gas a little bit and kind of coast and work on the unsexy things.
Yeah, it's so
Yeah.
hard. It's so hard to like think you're getting better by not getting totally thrashed. But it's the same, like you
Yeah.
go back to other things like running. It's like, okay, I'm just gonna go out there and go until I fall over, and that'll make me better at marathoning. No, I mean, like, you got to be able to go the distance. And so
Mhm.
when you're marathoning, you start out slow and you build it up. And there's so many more tangible examples that make more sense when you're like, we're rock climbers, we should understand. But I can talk to you about finances or relationships or marathons, and then you start to understand. You're like, oh, that is dumb. You know, it's like I'm going to eat, all of my meals, for the week in one meal,
Mhm.
and really try to get her done. And it's just never. I there's all kinds of ways of looking at it, but the most important thing is let's look at the long view. Can I do a little bit more each of these sessions for 10 to 12 sessions? And that's when we start to get better.
Yeah. And I do wonder if people might confuse trying hard and suffering. Like those two are like they're so different. And I almost think suffering's easier to do. Like you can just blast it, you can do moderate exercise and just go until you're dead. Whereas like trying hard taps into something very, very different.
Yeah.
And I think that's, like we're not saying don't try hard, we're saying don't kill yourself.
Well, I think like actually getting better at something is a real try hard, and you can suffer. Like if great example is like I can suffer by doing tons and tons and tons of V4s, but I can climb V4. The thing that's going to make me really, really try hard is if I go on V8 and I'm like, I just can barely do the moves and barely succeed. That's how I'm starting to change my climbing rather than just my ability to sustain stamina. And
Yeah.
the physical stuff is always falls behind our actual ability to put it together on the rock correctly.
Yeah. Cool. All right. We are almost out of time. The last thing I wanted to talk about was board climbing. It's a big thing now. I am really stoked to see more climbing gyms building spaces that have training boards. What are your thoughts on training boards, and do you make room in training plans for training boards?
Yeah, the thing I said, and I got a lot of grief about it, but I said the number one result of someone putting a moon board in their house is injury. Um, but it is. And so because they're cool, but they're also like this like distilled version of of the hardest thing you could possibly do. It's like drinking grain alcohol. And so you've got to be really, really careful. And so we need to be conservative in our warm-ups. We need to be conservative in implementing it into our training programs. But they are really nice. The problem with boards, and actually there are some of the researchers that are a lot smarter than I am are talking about different problems that they're starting to see show up. Physical therapists are talking about board shoulder, like this shoulder from climbing consistently on a 40-degree overhang. I'm doing the same moves on the same plane, the same distances between holds, and people are starting to get these overuse injuries. And so it's important, if the board varies in angle, you should change the angles. If it doesn't, you should vary the problems grades that you do instead of just getting up to your limit and going for it. But yeah, they're awesome, and it is a supercharger. It's one of the very best ways for people to get better at the hardest parts of crux climbing. And so, but just like every other thing, you should only have a small amount of it. It can't be all you do, or you just risk, the risk reward goes the wrong direction, and we don't really want that.
Yeah, and it seems like you're focusing again on maybe just one skill rather than developing kind of like your toolbox. And that's one great thing about bouldering in a climbing gym, if that's what you have access to, is that you have a lot more variety in movement, rather than like this 40-degree overhang over and over again, for sure.
Yeah, 2 days a week of that, ramped up, progressed slowly and carefully, and monitored. If my shoulder starts to hurt, if my wrists or elbows start to hurt, let's make a change. Like injury is not an acceptable outcome of training. And so if your training session produced any sense of overuse, the training session needs to be assessed right away, because day one is when we can fix it right away. If it's like, man, this has been hurting me every single session for the last 3 weeks, we might be 8 weeks into a rehab at that point. And so we need to be really, really careful about that and make a change. Yeah, just go back to the other part of the bouldering gym, or spend 2 weeks in the weight room, make sure that those issues go away, and then come back and readdress it. And if it continually shows up, that's when you talk to a therapist or a coach and see what's going on that's causing that. Maybe it is your positioning, maybe it's your movement, maybe it's, there's all kinds of things that cause it. But most of it's just too much volume.
Cool. Yeah.
All right.
Any last thoughts, Steve? I mean, we still have quite a bit on this list. But yeah,
Well,
do you have anything to wrap this
I
up?
know you've gotten some questions and things too, that we, from older ones that we've done. maybe we just need to take the remainder of the list and, put it in a smorgasbord of remaining things to talk about. Because we always, when you and I are talking offline, it's just like there's always a ton more things that are coming up all the time. And so
Yeah.
yeah, so maybe we'll plan out another one here in a little while.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for the series. Like your time is precious and I really appreciate it. So yeah, thanks a lot. We'll see you
Yeah,
soon.
thanks, please.
Okay.
All
Bye.
right, bye.